Hi folks, today I'm going to be walking through one of the scarier parts of a DIY camper conversion, and that's installing a consumer unit and its associated contraband, the RCD, MCB, etc. It's actually pretty straightforward, so I'm going to walk you through it step by step and hopefully make it seem a little less scary. Just so that you're aware, this is covered under the BS 7671 regulations here in the UK. If you're from outside the UK, make sure you're following your local area codes. You can download those regulations, but it's quite expensive to do so. So I'm actually going to give you all of those relevant regulations here in these videos to make sure that you're well up to spec. Now, just a quick disclaimer, those regulations are correct at the time of filming, but do make sure you're up to date with those. Obviously, I can't take any responsibility for any of your crazy Einstein-style installations that you're going to be doing, so please do so at your own risk. Anyway, enough rambling. Let's jump in and take a close look at these parts. So these items are common across every installation. We've got our consumer unit casing here. You might see consumer unit abbreviated to CU. Got our RCD, which is a residual current device, and a couple of MCBs, or miniature circuit breakers. Firstly, let's take a close look at our RCD and MCBs here. Now, you might notice that these are quite chunky, and the reason being is that these are double pole and not single pole. Now, it is part of the regs that you must install double pole RCDs and double pole MCBs rather than single pole. Now, what's the difference between the two, and why do we need to do that? Now, a single pole RCD would be half the width, and you'd only install your live conductor or cable through it rather than your live and neutral as you would here in a double pole installation. A single pole RCD, therefore, is only going to provide protection across the live conductor, whereas a double pole is going to provide it across both the live and neutral. Now, why would we need to do that? Because surely in a domestic setting, the 230 volts is only going to be running through the live conductor. So why is it different in a camper installation? Well, firstly, you could run into what's called reverse polarity, mainly at campsite hookups, which is where the live and the neutral have been wired in the wrong way round. So instead of your 230 volt running through your live conductor, it would run through your neutral conductor instead. So you can see why both need to be isolated. So another thing that can occur if you're installing what's called a center tapped inverter, and I'll explain what one of those is a little bit later on, is that the 230 volts is split evenly across the live and the neutral conductor. So there's 115 volts in the live and 115 in the neutral. So if we only had a single pole RCD, it would therefore cut the 150 volts that's going through the live conductor, but there'd still be 115 volts live going through the neutral, which could be a little bit spicy. Now, if you type in camper van consumer units into eBay or into Amazon, it's very misleading because there's a ton of them that are all filled with single pole MCBs and RCDs, which for the reasons mentioned before aren't fit for purpose. Unfortunately, you've got to spend a little bit more money, and I'll leave a link in the description to these exact RCDs and MCBs, but if you get the double pole ones, you'll definitely know that your system is completely safe to use. So what's the difference between an RCD and an MCB? How do they differ in functionality? Well, an RCD is basically going to protect you against electrical shock and any earth faults. So it will pick up if there's any imbalances in the current, which is typically an imbalance of about 30 milliamps. And when it does, it will then isolate that and it will stop you from getting shocked any further, basically. The MCB is going to protect against overcurrent and any short circuits. So basically the RCD is going to protect you, the MCB is going to protect the electrical installation and equipment. There is something called an RCBO, which combines the functionality of an RCD and an MCB in one unit, and you can install those in a camper conversion as well. You would install one on each individual circuit, but I'm going to show you this method because it's more of a sort of a common practice. Just one thing to note, both your RCDs and your MCBs should be made by the same manufacturer. There can be some compatibility issues across different brands, so just to err on the safe side, just make sure they're all made by the same people. So when we're purchasing these units, there's a few different things that we need to consider to make sure it's all spec correctly. So let's take a close look at the RCD first to work out what those are. So our RCD is an absolutely necessary part of our installation. Not only is it going to protect us against electrical shocks and earth faults, it's also going to act as a main switch for our consumer unit. The first thing to look out for is how quickly it's going to isolate the power in the event of a fault. They shouldn't exceed 30 milliamps, which is known as the heart stop current. As you can see, it says 0.03 amps here, so that is 30 milliamps. So different RCDs are classed by different types. This is a type A RCD, is the one that you want to be using. Sometimes you'll see a type AC, but they may not always trip in the event of a fault if they're powering a DC component, whereas a type A RCD is going to trip whether it's powering an AC or DC component regardless. We can tell it's a type A because it's got these two squiggles here. Type AC just tends to have the one top squiggle on that symbol. A type A RCD is particularly important if you're installing an induction hob, and because that will give out pulsating DC residual currents. You can get type B RCDs, but they're more for things like EV chargers. The only other thing to consider is the current rating. This is rated to 63 amps, as we can see here. And generally the current rating should either match or exceed the maximum load of the circuit that it's protecting. Most campsites are going to give you a maximum of 16 amps at hookup, so I generally work to the premise that 16 amps is going to be the maximum that's going to be pulled across any of my 230 volt circuits. Anything below 16 amps, I'm going to start experiencing some nuisance tripping. So aside from it being double pole, that's everything we've got to look out for when we're purchasing our RCD. So looking at our MCB now, again, the manufacturer has to match that of the RCD and the other MCBs. Again, it has to be double pole. The only thing we really need to look out for is this C10 here. So the C again represents the type, much like the RCD and myself. We all have our types. Generally type B is going to be fine for most installations unless you've got an appliance which you expect to have a surge or an inrushing current, such as something with an electrical motor or an induction hob, then a type C will be required. That's going to be the case in our instance. It's going to be an induction hob on one of the sockets, so hence the C in the C10. The 10 here refers to the current rating in amps, and to size your MCB you're going to need to calculate the total load of your circuit in watts, and then we're going to convert that into amps. So to do that we use a little formula where we take the wattage of your circuit, then we divide it by the voltage. So if we take our little plinth heater for example, which is 700 watts, we then divide that by the voltage, which is 230 volts. 700 divided by 230 gives us 3.04. We then need to include a 25% safety margin, so we'll take that 3.04 and then we times it by 1.25, which gives us 3.8 amps. So we just need to ensure that our MCB is rated to at least 3.8 amps. The next size up was a 6, so we actually have a C6 MCB. Generally speaking, we're going to install the MCB with the largest amp rating closest to the RCD. For every consumer unit, you're going to need to install one RCD, and the MCBs are dependent on how many circuits you have and how many plug sockets you want each MCB to support. In the instance of our C6 MCB, this is just going to be supporting one plug socket. This is going to our plinth heater, so that just has one individual MCB for that one individual plug socket. For our C10 MCB here, this is actually going to be supporting 3 different plug sockets via what's called a radial circuit, which means that the wiring is going to go to the first plug socket, then it's going to come out and go to the second, and so on to the third. But you could by all means install an individual MCB for each of those individual sockets. Both methods have their pros and cons. In the case of installing an individual MCB for my individual socket that's supporting the plinth heater, it's going to be really easy for me to identify where there's a fault. On this MCB though, where there's 3 sockets being supported, it's going to take a little bit more time, be a little bit more tricky. On the other hand, buying an individual MCB for every individual circuit is going to be more costly, not just in MCBs, but also for the extra cabling. You've also got to think this is going to take up more room in your consumer unit, so if you're quite tight on space, this might be a better option. So let's just quickly recap before we all have a big brain fart. The RCDs and MCBs all need to be of the same manufacturer. They all need to be double pole. The RCD needs to have a minimum cutout threshold of 30 milliamps, needs to be type A, and the amp rating needs to match or exceed the total amp rating of all your circuits. The MCBs are generally okay to be type B unless you're going to be plugging in an induction hob or something with an electrical motor, then they need to be type C. And the amp rating of these needs to be the amp rating of that individual circuit plus that 25% safety margin. Let's take a wee break. Louis want a belly rub. Louis want a belly rub. Yeah. Oh boy. Oh. Oh. Is that nice? Is that nice? Okay, so moving on to something slightly less technical now is the consumer unit casing. Now there's nothing in the regs that states this has to be made from a non-combustible material such as metal, which it does for domestic installation. So you can either err on the side of caution and get a metal consumer unit box, or you could use a plastic one like this, and I'll leave a link in the description for one of these. There are some regs though on the holes for cable entry. There must be holes for cable entry for a start. And those holes must not be able to let a finger accidentally come through and sort of touch anything hazardous. And if you're mounting this specifically on a wall, then this top section here should be able to allow an object that's 1 millimeter in diameter and 5 millimeters in length to pass through. To prevent that, we could use something like this. This is a cable entry gland. So we use an arbor bit or a hole saw piece to cut the hole out in the side of the casing. Then we can push this threaded piece through on one side, and then we use the nut on the other side to tighten that and lock it down into place. Then we can feed our cabling through here, and as we tighten this nut, it will just tighten down onto the cable, and it will create a really nice tight fit that will comply with those IP ratings. You could install a rubber grommet, but don't forget you shouldn't be able to get a finger through that could touch anything hazardous. And if you're mounting the consumer to a wall, don't forget the 1mm object rule as well. Whatever method you use, just make sure those raw edges are protected so you don't accidentally cut into the cable over time with the ongoing vibrations of a van and cause some sort of fault. So taking a closer look at what we have here, we've got this little window that opens up, and that will give you nice easy access to the switches if they trip. Got 4 screws that would hold this front face in place, so once they're removed you can just pop this out. Then on the inside we've got 2 bus bars up here, so one would be an earth bus bar and one we possibly use as a neutral bus bar. We've got the 4 attachment points that we're going to attach this physically to the unit with, and then we've got our DIN rail here, and our DIN rail is our point of attachment for our MCBs and our RCD. So if we take a look at the back of the RCD, you can see we've got these 2 hook points here that would hook onto the DIN rail, and there's this one at the bottom here, but we need to push this tab out first in order to do so. We can just hook this top section on first onto the DIN rail and the bottom, and then push that tab in. There we have it, that's not coming off. And then when you want to release that, you just get a flathead screwdriver, push it into the tab at the bottom there, push that against the RCD, that will unclip it, and then we can pull that back out again. So next we consider where we're going to mount our consumer unit casing. We want to do so in an accessible location. Obviously if any of the switches trip or we need to do some maintenance, it needs to be in an accessible place to do so. So I've made this purpose-built electrical unit, so I'm going to install my consumer unit up top. As you can see, I've made this pre-routed slot to allow for cable entry. Just consider how your cabling is going to come through, not just through your furniture, but through your consumer unit as well. We've got these cable entry glands, as I mentioned before, that need to be installed. It's going to be easier to do this now before it's in situ. So I need to consider how many I need to install. So for most people, you're going to have an input side from your mains inlet that's going to be going into your RCD. So that'll be 1 cable entry gland. And then you need to install as many of these as you have MCBs. So if I've got, say, 1 plug socket coming off an MCB, I'll just need 1 more cable entry gland. If I've got 3 MCBs going to 3 plug sockets, I'll need 3 more cable entry glands. There are these little knockout points here, so you can install some of those in there. I'm actually going to install 2 consumer units here because I absolutely love it, and also because I've got an inverter charger that I'm installing. More on that later, but that means I need 3 cable entry glands here, 3 there, and I'm going to install a rubber grommet on either side of these consumer unit casings so that cables can pass through from one unit to the other. Alrighty, so I've got M20 cable entry glands. That means I need a 20mm bit, whether that's an arbor bit, hole saw bit, wood bit, anything that cuts a hole. I'm just going to run this through the top here. That threaded section should be able to fit through. A few more of those. Now they're in, I've pre-drilled the mounting holes. I'm going to put this in situ. I'm going to mark off where the screws need to go with a pencil. Going to pre-drill the holes. Now I use some flathead screws to screw this into place. Now these are in, I can populate them with the RCDs and MCBs. I'm going to first open up these terminals here, just getting a little Phillips head screwdriver and opening them up all the way. I'm going to begin populating and wiring in this consumer unit here. I'm going to ignore this one for now. I'm actually going to do sort of a mock-up example of an install rather than doing my own one for the time being, just so that I can show you the basics of it and we can go through the technical aspects of it, and then I'll do my own full install afterwards and explain that to you as well. So this example I'm going to show you here is how you would wire in a consumer unit if you're just going to use your plug sockets when you're hooked up at a campsite. By using this method, you wouldn't be able to use your plug sockets when you're off grid. To do that, you would need to install what's called an inverter. An inverter is going to take your 12-volt DC power at your leisure battery and it's going to convert it into 230-volt AC power that can be used when you're off grid so that your plug sockets are readily available all of the time, not just when you're hooked up at a campsite. For those purposes, you need to install a second consumer unit, which is what I'm going to show you a little bit later on down the line. But first, let's start with this sort of basic setup first so we can understand the main principles of what we're doing. So I'm going to start by putting the RCD inside. Don't forget to pull the tab out so that it will actually slot into place. For our mock-up example here, I'm going to have 2 plug sockets that are individually supplied by 2 individual MCBs. One of them is going to supply my plinth heater, so I just need a 6 amp MCB. and the others go into a plug socket, and I'm going to supply that with a 10 amp MCB. As mentioned before, the MCB with the highest amp rating needs to go closest to the RCD. Put that onto there. And the 6 can be popped into here. So firstly, let's approach our input side of our circuit. So I'm going to assume at this point you've got a mains hookup point already installed on the side of your van, and from there you should have a 3-core cable that's going to be running from that mains hookup point through your walls, furniture, etc. We're going to run it through this cable entry point, through this cable entry gland into our consumer unit. Before we do that though, I'm going to crimp on some ferrule crimps. Let me show you what those are. Let's pretend this is the cable coming through our mains hookup. Let's firstly run it through our cable entry point. We're going to be running this cable into the earth bar as well as the live and neutral terminals here at the top of the RCD. So kind of mock it up into a position where it's close to that. Once you're happy, we can then work out roughly where we can then strip this outer layer of insulation. We want to make sure that this outer insulation is present all the way into the consumer unit. Once you're happy, you can mark it off with something, I don't know, a pencil or something. And then we know that we can strip it from that point. Okay, there's our mark. That's where I'm going to start removing the outer sheathing. Just make sure that you don't nip the insulation of the cables underneath. I'm going to use a pair of wire cutters to sort of run around here lightly and then just try and wrestle this bit of insulation off. Could use a Stanley knife by all means, by the way. Just check the insulation of these 3 cables is still intact. If you're happy, we can crimp on some ferrule connectors onto the ends of these cables. So remember, we have to install multi-stranded flexible cable for our 230-volt installs. We can't use solid core cable like you would in a domestic installation. But the problem we've got with these multi-stranded cables is that they are more brittle, therefore they're more prone to damage. If we were to just strip the end of the cable and pop it in a terminal, tighten it down on those strands, and there could be a tendency for those to get damaged, and therefore the cable can't carry as much capacity as it is actually rated to. So what we do to counteract this is crimp on one of these ferrule crimps. That's just going to compact all of those strands together. It's going to make sure that they don't get damaged when we close down that terminal, and make sure that we get a really good connection. What I'm going to do is grab my wire stripper here. I'm going to extend this end out so that we've got plenty of copper strands that will pop out the end of the ferrule. Then I'll just pop my cable in. Strip it. Okay, now don't be tempted to twist the strands. What you need to do is just place the ferrule crimp directly over the top, making sure the strands stay nice and straight. There's different size ferrule crimps, obviously different size cables. I've got 2.5mm square cable here, so I'm using the blue ferrule crimps. I'm going to push this crimp all the way on until the insulation of the cable butts up against this tapered part of the crimp. Okay, I'm going to take my ferrule crimping tool, and again I'll leave a link in the description to one of these. I'm going to place my cable in like so, till that tapered part is butted all the way up to the end, then just tighten down, and then it should release once you've pushed the handle all the way in. Oop. Cut away any excess copper strands, and there you have it. When I route these cables, I'm going to try and run them behind the DIN rail just to try and keep the install as clean as possible. God, I really made this awkward for myself. I'm making this so fucking tight. We've now got our main supply coming in through here from the mains inlet. Now we can hook that up to the top of the RCD. So we're going to start with this left hand side, which has an N on it for neutral, so that's our blue cable, and the right hand side is going to take our live cable, which is in brown. The green and yellow earth cable is going to be connected up here to the earth bus bar. There's not a whole lot of room up here, so if you find it easier, you could just unhook the RCD with that tab at the bottom, take it out and install your cables, and then just pop it back in place. You can also more easily check your connections really good as well by doing this. For the earth cable, I'm going to install it up here on the bus bar. I'm going to install it on the third screw along, and I'll install the earth from these two MCBs on these two screws here. Hopefully it goes without saying, but make sure your mains hookup isn't plugged in whilst you're doing this, by the way. If you're wondering how tight this terminal should be, the manufacturer actually specifies it should be tightened to 2.5 nanometers using a Torx screwdriver. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those. I've just got a standard screwdriver, so I'm tightening this down till it's pretty tight so that the cables aren't going to come loose, but so that they're not so tight that I'm actually going to damage them. Really though, if you're doing this properly, you should use a Torx screwdriver. So now that we know that this cable here is our incoming supply cable that's being terminated at the top of the RCD, you're probably wondering what the top of the MCBs are going to be used for. And there's a really easy way to comprehend this. Easiest way to think of it is that the top of our RCD is our input side and the top of our MCBs is our output side. So we know we've got our supply coming in through the top of the RCD and then it's going out through the top of the MCBs to our plug sockets. So this second cable here has been terminated at my first plug socket. So my first plug socket is installed on the wall. The cabling is then running through the wall, through my electrical unit here. It's coming up through here in one continuous piece. It mustn't be joined. And now we're going to connect it directly to our MCB. So hopefully now you can picture that output side is supplying directly to our first plug socket from out of the top of this MCB here. So same as our RCD, we just need to connect the neutral on the left side, our live on the right hand side, and then we're going to connect the earth up to the earth bus bar on this second screw here. Our third cable here is going to be terminated on the top of our second MCB, which is only rated to 6 amps because it's just powering our plinth heater, which is only 700 watts. So I need to do the same as before. Terminate the neutral on the left, live on the right, and our earth at the top here. So we're almost there now in terms of installing cabling that's travelling outside of the confines of the consumer unit, except for this earth cable. So next up we're going to install this main earth cable. This is going to be attached to the main earth terminal and then it's going to be grounded or bonded to the chassis of the vehicle. The purpose of this is to create a fault path, so if there is a fault, it will travel through the earth cable down into the ground rather than through you. To attach it or to bond it to the chassis of the vehicle, we're going to use one of these ring terminals here. So I'm just going to crimp this on and then it's got some heat shrink here for added protection. And then we're going to use this screw to hold it in place. I'm going to use a couple of washers to stop the screw from turning itself out with the ongoing vibrations of the vehicle as it goes down the road. So first up, we're just going to cut the cable to size. You can then strip the wire using a pair of automated wire strippers like these. Just to know, we need to use flexible cord cable, just like we have done with all our other 230 volt installations. We mustn't use domestic rigid core cable. And in terms of size, it needs to be at least 4 millimeters squared. So we can now take our ratchet crimping tool and insert the crimp. We can insert the cable and then tighten that down. Wow. Just give that a light tug test, and if you're happy, we can get the heat gun on the heat shrink here. Nice, there we have it. So this is where the 12 volt ground is going to go, so I'm going to install the 230 volt just next to it here. Wherever you're going to install this needs to be in an accessible location. You need to be able to do maintenance on it and just check that it's still connected properly. It's important to note that the 12 volt ground and the 230 volt ground shouldn't be ground together. They need to be ground separately. So I'm going to pre-drill for my screw. Two nice clean connections, so I'm just going to clean this up with a little bit of sandpaper. So now I'm going to grab the screw with the little washer on, grab our main earth cable and then just send it home. Nice. So lastly, you'll just need to add this label that says safety electrical connection, do not remove. You just need to place that somewhere near the main earth cable. Great, there we have it. Now I haven't installed a cable entry gland because this is just a mock-up, so we'll just pretend this rubber grommet is one. And I've crimped on this little ferrule terminal here. We're going to terminate this at the earth bus bar here on this far left hand side. So that's the hardest bit done now, and really when you break it down it's not actually that scary of a task to do. Next I'm going to add a bus bar at the bottom, so that's going to connect our 3 neutral terminals here and our 3 live terminals. Okay, this is what our bus bar looks like, and we're going to use this to connect all of the lives and the neutrals between our RCD and MCBs. So you can kind of think of this as an extension of your cabling, although this does give sort of a cleaner finish and it's a bit quicker to use as well. It's important to note this is a double pole bus bar rather than a single pole. A single pole bus bar will be useful if you just had single pole MCBs, where you just need to connect all the lives from the RCD and the MCB together. Of course, with our double pole setup, we need to connect our lives and our neutrals, but we don't want to connect them all together, which would be the case if we used a single pole bus bar. Instead, we want to separate them. So that's why there's 2 rows here rather than 1 row of metal. So that separates our lives and neutrals. So if we were to pull this out, you'll be able to see how that would be separated. And finally, those metal strips are then pushed into this sort of insulation. That's just going to protect any fingers that go away into the consumer unit. You could either buy these cut to size, or you could buy a long piece and then just cut it down to what you need. So before I install the bus bar, I'm just going to make sure all of my terminals are opened all the way out. Now all I need to do is insert the bus bar and tighten those terminals up. And there we have it, the wiring is now complete on this particular consumer unit setup. So just to quickly recap, we've got our mains hookup cable coming in through here. That's being terminated at the top of our RCD in our input side. So we've got the neutral cable being terminated on the left, the live on the right, and then the earth is being terminated on the earth bus bar. Then on the output side of our RCD here, we've installed a double pole bus bar. Remember, it has to be double pole, not single pole. And that's connecting into the input side of our 2 MCBs here. So our MCBs are now connected to our RCD, so now we're just concerned about the output side of our MCBs. So we've taken our 3-core cable and we've installed the neutral cable on the left-hand side of our MCB, the live on the right-hand side, just like our RCD. And again, we've also terminated our earth cable to the earth bus bar at the top. This cable then continues on through my walls of the camper van over to my first plug socket. And of course, you can add as many MCBs and plug sockets as is required. So at this point, rather than just taking my word for it that this installation is correct, I'm actually going to explain how the electricity is going to flow through the system now that we have this kind of finished visual example here, so that you can better understand it and be 100% confident with your own knowledge going forward. So let's begin by looking at how the current is going to flow through our installation here on our input side first. So we've rocked up at a campsite. I've now plugged into the shore power through our mains hookup. So this 3-core mains cable is connected to our hookup point, and current is going to begin flowing specifically through the brown live conductor. So imagine that current is now flowing through that brown live conductor and is being terminated at the top of our RCD here. That current is then going to travel through the RCD towards the output side. We've then connected that to the input side of our MCB. So that current's now going to flow through the MCB towards the output side of the MCB. And then that live conductor is then going to travel on to our first plug socket. That current will then flow through the appliance. There's a bit of a misconception that the current will just end there, but actually it will then output via the neutral cable. So that current's going to continue on then out of the appliance, out of the plug socket, towards our MCB here. It's going to flow through the MCB, back up through the RCD, and then back out to our mains hookup point. So that current flows all the way around. Firstly through our brown live conductor into the appliance, then back out through our blue neutral cable all the way back to the mains hookup point. So it's important we know this to understand how an RCD is going to operate as a safety feature. In theory, the current flowing through our brown live conductor to our appliance should be the same as the current that's flowing back out through our neutral conductor. The job of our RCD is to trip and isolate the circuit when there's a difference of more than 30 milliamps, as stated here, between our live conductor and our neutral conductor. This is important because if we were to come into contact with an electrical fault, that current is going to be travelling through that live conductor up to the appliance, but instead of it travelling safely away through the neutral conductor and back through our RCD, it's going to be travelling through us. By having that RCD installed, it's going to detect that imbalance between the neutral conductor and the live conductor. It's going to trip the RCD, it's going to isolate the supply, and it's going to prevent us from being electrocuted any further. So our MCB is going to trip in a different way to our RCD. Our RCD is going to trip due to that imbalance between the neutral and the live conductor. Our MCB is going to trip because it's been overloaded beyond its rated current rating. In this particular case, it has a current rating of 10 amps on this MCB, 6 amps on this MCB. So how would this occur? Let's use our 6 amp MCB as an example. Now 6 amps is equivalent to 1380 watts. If we were to plug in a 3000 watt appliance into the plug socket that's connected to this MCB, that's going to far surpass that 6 amp rating, and it's going to cause the MCB to trip. And why would we want it to do this? We're going to remember that when we were designing our electrical circuits and we were sizing our cabling, we sized it to that 6 amp current rating. Our cabling therefore is more than likely not designed to carry anything more than that. So if we were to take our 6 amp or 1380 watt rating and we more than double that to 3000 watts, it's going to overheat that cabling because it's not designed to carry that capacity. It's going to cause the insulation to melt and potentially cause a fire. Also, if your live or neutral conductors were to accidentally, say, become frayed, or they came loose and they came into contact with one another, that would also cause the circuit to overload, and at that point the MCB would also trip. Now we understand the different safety features between the RCD and the MCBs, we understand how the current is flowing through our circuit. The only thing we haven't covered is what our earth cables are doing. Now under normal operating conditions, there should be no current flowing through our earth cables. It's only under fault conditions. Let's try and give you an example of a fault that might occur. Say you're using a microwave in your camper van, and that microwave has a metal casing around it. Inside the casing, there's going to be a 3-core cable, just like our circuits here, so you can have a live, neutral and an earth conductor. Now let's say the live conductor has come loose over time, when you've been bumbling across the roads for years on end, and it's touching the metal casing. Well, that metal casing has now become live, so if you come into contact with it, there's potential there for you to have a shock. Now a fault current is always going to seek the path of lowest resistance, and an earth cable such as this one that's connected from the bus bar here and is ground out onto the chassis of the vehicle is going to have far lower resistance than the human body is. So when that fault occurs, a large amount of that current is going to flow through this cable here from our microwave down into the ground via the chassis of the vehicle. And of course, because there's an imbalance between the neutral and the live conductor, our RCD is going to trip in good time and also isolate the power. Cool, so this has covered everything for this basic setup, and remember, this will allow you to install a hookup point, and then you'll have 2 plug sockets here running off of there. They're only going to operate when you're hooked up at a campsite hookup. And of course, as I mentioned before, this doesn't involve using an inverter. So what I'm going to do now is actually wire mine up in the way that I actually need to wire it up. And I'm going to walk you through what I've done here exactly and how I've managed to encompass the inverter and make sure everything is wired in safely. So we'll move on to that next. Alrighty, so you have just completed the camper van conversion consumer unit crash course, so congratulations. Don't forget, this is just a basic setup, so you can only use your plug sockets when you're hooked up at a campsite. So if you want to use them when you're not at a campsite and you're off grid, you need to install what's called an inverter. Now an inverter is going to transform your 12 volt DC from your leisure battery into 230 volt AC. There's obviously pros and cons to having one installed. The obvious pro being that you can use your 230 volt plug sockets when you're not at a campsite, so you're not tethered to them as much. That might save you a little bit of money if you do have to use them a lot. One of the cons is the cost. This inverter charger here was roughly about £300 or so. And you've got the wiring, the extra RCD, MCBs, consumer unit, etc. to install as well and to think about. It's obviously more complicated to wire in a system like this. And an inverter isn't 100% efficient either. This particular inverter charger from Renogy is about 90% efficient. As you can imagine, that's quite a big step up from 12 volt DC to 230 volt AC. So there is a little bit of a loss. So for every 100 amps that we pull from the leisure battery, when we've got the inverter on, we're going to get about 90 amps of usable power at our plug sockets. Now my recommendation would actually be not to install an inverter if you could go without using your 230 volt plug sockets when you're off grid. A lot of laptops, cameras, drones, things like that can all be charged via 12 volt USB. That's going to be a more efficient way to use the power stored in your leisure battery, and it's going to save you some money as well. But if you can't do without those 230 volt plug sockets when you're off grid, then I'll show you how I've done my particular setup. When you go to purchase an inverter, there's a few things you need to consider. Firstly is the wattage rating. So you need to think about what the most amount of wattage is that you're going to be pulling through your system at any one time and make sure that it's rated to at least that. You're also going to need to consider whether you get a pure sine wave inverter or a modified sine wave inverter. The modified is cheaper, but it has more of a stepped angular waveform, which is less stable and probably less suitable for sensitive electronics such as a laptop. Pure sine wave inverter has a much smoother waveform, therefore it's far more stable, far more suitable for sensitive electronics, and you can expect it to behave more like a domestic plug socket. For this particular setup, I'm actually going to install this Renogy 2000 watt inverter charger. This is a pure sine wave inverter, so we know we're going to get the cleanest electrical current from it. Being that it's an inverter charger, it's actually going to do 2 jobs for the price of 1. Not only are the 230 volt plug sockets going to be available to us when we're off grid, but when we're hooked up at a campsite, it's actually going to charge our leisure battery as well. A cool feature of this particular inverter charger is that when we're hooked up at the campsite, it's going to automatically prioritise pulling our energy from the grid rather than depleting the leisure battery. Now, as mentioned before, installing an inverter does make your system more complicated. We're now going to have to install 2 consumer units rather than just one. We're going to have one on the input side of our inverter and one on the output side. So let's take a closer look and see how that's done. So I'm just going to quickly explain why I've installed 2 consumer units rather than just the one. And to do this, it would help if we follow the flow of electricity that's actually coming from our mains hookup point. So imagine that electricity is flowing into our first consumer unit, then back out into the input side of our inverter charger, and normally back out towards our plug sockets. And that's fine when we're at a mains hookup because our inverter charger here automatically prioritises that electricity supply coming from the mains hookup point, which therefore means that it's protected by our RCD and MCB here. The problem we've got though is that when we're using our plug sockets off grid, our 230 volt supply is actually going to start here rather than all the way back here where our protective devices are installed. So that therefore means that our plug sockets are no longer protected, nor is the cabling. The solution is to install a second consumer unit. Therefore, when we're using our plug sockets off grid, we're now protected by this RCD and these MCBs here. To make things more complicated, this particular inverter is known as a center tapped inverter, or sometimes it's called a floating earth inverter. Do check if yours is, and if so, you're also going to need to install one of these AC contactors. I can make a whole video on the reason why for this. There's actually already a really good one, so I'll leave a link in the description to that so you can watch it. But essentially, a center tapped inverter doesn't have a neutral to earth bond, and that is essential for our RCD to trip when we're using 230 volts on the inverter side. If we didn't install this AC contactor, the RCD would still trip when we're at the mains hookup, but when we're using those 230 volt plug sockets off of the inverter, our RCD wouldn't trip. So it's a big safety hazard that we need to remedy. It's starting to sound a little scary now, but it's really not. I'll walk you through this step by step so you can carry this out yourselves. I'll also leave a link in the description to a really good wiring diagram that will very clearly show you how to wire in this AC contactor, and it's really good alongside this Renogy inverter charger in particular. Taking a closer look at consumer unit 1 and 2 then, we can see it's not dissimilar to our previous setup. Both consumer units have an RCD followed by MCBs that are pretty much wired in the same way as before. The only difference we have here is the AC contactor. So as before, we begin at the mains hookup point on the side of the van. I've got a cable coming from that, running through the walls, and it's coming out here and then inputting into our first consumer unit. So that cable is then running behind my DIN rail here, and I'm terminating it just as before on the input side at the top of our RCD here. So I've got the neutral terminated on the left and the live on the right, and then the earth is being terminated at the earth bus bar. On the output side of our RCD, we've connected it to the input side of our MCB via a double pole bus bar. Now the output side of our first MCB here is where things get slightly different, and you can see that there are 2 cables being terminated here rather than just one. So let's take a closer look at how we did that. I just thought we could take a closer look at the contactor before I go ahead and explain all the wiring, just so we can get a little familiar with it. Again, as I say, I'll leave a link in the description for this exact one so you know which one you need to buy. So I'm making a start wiring my contactor to my MCB, and you might notice that we've got 2 cables that are being terminated in the same terminal here at the top of the MCB. You might be wondering how to do that. The solution is to use a double ferrule crimp like this. That's going to allow enough room for 2 cables to be terminated together. So let's go and crimp those on the neutral cable. Taking a closer look at how our contactor is wired in, we start by taking a look at the output side of our MCB. We can see we have 2 neutral cables terminated on this left-hand side. One of them is being terminated in terminal 3 of our AC contactor, and the other one's being terminated in terminal A2 on our contactor. Taking a closer look at our live conductors, you can see again it's terminated on that right hand side on the output side of our MCB. There's 2 cables again. One of them is terminated in terminal 1 of the contactor and the other in A1. Taking a look at the output side of our contactor, we're going to be using a 3-core cable to do so, which is going to run to our inverter. We're going to terminate the live cable at terminal 2, the neutral at terminal 4, and the earth at the earth bus bar. The only other thing to consider is the cable for our neutral to earth bond, which is terminated on this very far right hand side of our contactor. If we take a look on our first consume unit, we've got our earth bus bar up here. On our second consume unit, we've not only got an earth bus bar on this right hand side, but we've also got a neutral bus bar on the left hand side. What we're going to do now is connect a cable from our neutral bus bar. We're going to feed it through our 2 consume units, down the back of the DIN rail here, and into terminal R4 at the bottom of our contactor. That's going to provide our neutral to earth bond. Then on the top of our contactor, we're going to terminate an earth cable into terminal R3 and terminate that at the earth bus bar on this first consumer unit. That's our AC contactor now wired in. It's a really essential piece of kit that you don't want to leave out. As I mentioned before, RCD isn't going to trip if we're using a center tapped inverter and don't have one of these installed. It's really surprising there's very little mention about this online or in any published books or even in the Renogy manual itself, which you really think would offer that information up about a key safety feature like this. So now we've covered that, let's follow this output side of the contactor here, following this 3-core cable to our inverter charger. So that cable is running from that output side of the contactor through our electrical unit here, down the side and into the input side of our inverter charger, which is this one at the bottom. So we've got the earth terminated at the bottom, followed by the live, then the neutral. It's all labelled here, so it's really easy to follow. And then this is the output side at the top here. And we've got neutral, live and earth. That cable is then outputting back out of the inverter, back through my electrical unit towards consumer unit 2. Our second consumer unit is wired in a very similar way to our previous setup. One difference being though that on this incoming cable, instead of us terminating our neutral into the top of the RCD here, we actually terminate it into this bus bar. And the second cable is terminated at the bus bar, and then that cable is the one that's terminated into the top of our RCD here. The reason we do this is so that we create a neutral bus bar where that neutral can be carried via this cable here and terminated at the bottom of our contactor, creating that neutral to earth bond. On from there, our RCD and MCBs are again connected by this double pole bus bar. Then as before, our MCBs are going to output from the top here on towards their relevant plug sockets. My first MCB here is going to supply our first plug socket, which then works its way around to some other plug sockets as well. And the second MCB is going to supply an individual plug socket that's supplying power to our plinth heater. Same as before, we terminate the neutral on the left, the live on the right, and then the earth at the earth bus bar for each MCB. That's pretty much the wiring now complete. There's just one cable left. This earth bus bar here is not actually connected to earth at this point, so we need to run a cable from this earth bus bar through our consumer units here to this other earth bus bar, where there is an earth cable being terminated onto the chassis of the van. So we're all wired in, so we can replace the cover now, but you can see that when we do, we've got a little bit of space on my particular consumer unit because this is an 8-way consumer unit and we've only fitted it with 6 ways because we've got 3 double poles, each taking 2 ways up. So obviously fingers could travel through here and get zapped, so we actually need to fill these by adding some consumer unit blanks. The ones I have here look very much like single pole MCBs, similar thing. We need to pull this tab down, then we can just hook it over the DIN rail and then push that tab up and that's locked into place. So I'll put one on either side. Okay, now as I hook this on, you should see, it's a bit tight, that those gaps are now filled, fingers can't travel through there. One last thing we need to do is just add one of these labels onto the front of our consumer unit. As you can see, it's just a label to say that there is a protective device on there and that it needs to be tested every 6 months or so. Just going to add a sticker on the side of the door here that just describes how to hook up to the mains and how to disconnect. We're basically done now. The final step is to get your system tested by a qualified electrician. They have the equipment to properly test whether an RCD is tripping. There are a few things that we can test ourselves with some fairly inexpensive equipment, but it doesn't substitute for proper testing by a qualified electrician using the appropriate tools. Just going to pop this little plug socket tester into the socket now. It's going to tell me if there's like a missing earth or a live earth reverse and things like that. The noise doesn't sound great, but if we take a look at the back of the tester, we can see that 2 green lights means that it's been wired correctly. There's a bunch of other error codes here that will indicate what the problem is if any do arise. Now you might have seen one of my previous conversions where I installed a center tapped inverter, that when I plugged this socket tester in, it actually came up that there was a problem. But now that we've got that contactor installed, that problem is now eradicated and our RCD is fully functional. Alrighty, so that's our consumer unit installed, now complete. But before we go ahead and use any of those plug sockets, it's pretty essential that we get this tested by someone who's qualified to do so. There will throw up if there's any issues with incorrect wiring or the RCD not working and things like that. It's really important that we understand that this is safe and functional to use before we go and use it. Hopefully this has answered some questions to one of the scarier parts of the electrical install. Do let me know if you've got any questions, add them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. I'll probably also pin a top comment as well with any extra tips or any afterthoughts I've had that I perhaps should have added into the video. I'll put down in there. If you found this video useful, it will really help me if you just interact with the video somehow, so give it a like, comment or share on it, etc. That will just help trigger the YouTube algorithm and make this financially viable to continue doing. So yes, much appreciated if you do. Thanks very much for watching. Hopefully I'll catch you in another video soon, but for now, best of luck with your build.